Cool, thank you. So, like Nicole said, I'm Tom Mohammed. I'm a lawyer at Anderson Lloyd here in Christchurch. I specialise in regulation and contract law, and I thought that today contract law probably wouldn't be that interesting to you all. So I met Nicole at a pub about 6 months ago, and I'd had a few beers, and I said that I would do this, and now I actually have to do it. So I've been frantically preparing this talk over the last couple of weeks, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So like the title suggests, carbon markets, you might have all heard about the emissions trading scheme, you might have heard about the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, all these things that the world has agreed, but we've seemingly made very little progress in actually resolving anything. So I thought I would just give a talk to you all today about the intention behind carbon markets, how they're supposed to work, how they're implemented, how they are actually working, and what we need to do to fix them, which is slightly a spoiler. So why should you listen to me? So I've put my credentials up on the screen. So I am a lawyer. This is not a legal speech per se. But I am, I think, qualified to talk about this because I do a lot of work in the climate space, particularly in New Zealand, and I've contributed to global guides on climate regulation in New Zealand. I've also drank some beers, and I have 2 cats, and you can see them here. So to understand carbon markets, we need to understand the issue, and that is climate change. I'm going to assume that all of you believe in climate change. Hasn't been the case at all of my talks. But I'll keep this brief. So we've actually known about climate change for a long time now. So it was in the early 1800s that we understood the greenhouse effect, which is essentially the collection of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere which trap heat and keep the Earth at an average surface temperature of 15 degrees Celsius. Without that, the Earth would be negative 18 degrees Celsius on average, and it is one of the reasons why this planet has life, and as far as we know, other planets don't. It took nearly 100 years for scientists to convince the United Nations that this was actually a serious issue and that we should do something about it. And in the late 1980s, the United Nations formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which essentially has the purpose of gathering the data, giving policy advice, and then helping keep the various governments of the world accountable on their progress. Following that, in the 90s, many of the countries around the world entered into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, which gave legitimacy to the issue on the global stage, with several major countries signing up. So we knew about it, and what did we do about it? We didn't do very much. So on this graph, you can see the maximum atmospheric carbon dioxide for the last 800,000 years. And you'll see that in 1911 we hit it, and then since then we've almost increased it by 50%. And while that has happened, there's been quite a close correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature increases versus that 15 degrees Celsius baseline. So I think the issue is real, and I think we should do something about it, and I think that everyone should think that. So how do we fix this? So there's 2 things we need to do. Firstly, we need to actually stop emitting as much as we are emitting. But as we saw in that graph just before, we've actually already emitted way too much, so we need to take it out. And if we do both of these things at the same time, we'll get a lot closer to meeting our climate targets, and we might actually have a chance at fixing this issue. However, it's not as easy as that, and the reason for that is because the world's economy runs on essentially, for-profit businesses providing services to people, and under the theories of economics, business and people, society as a whole, should achieve the best allocation of resources possible to get the best outcomes for everyone. But unfortunately, this has not necessarily happened in the context of climate change, and this in economics is known as market failure. So a potential solution to market failure is for the government to intervene, and that is why this is such a political issue. But to talk about the economics of it, I thought I would explain the concept of market failure. So, say that this is an emitting industry's supply curve, so they can emit heaps for a very low price. However, the cost to society of this activity happening is a lot higher than the cost to the person who's actually doing it. if we add in the demand curve for society as a whole's wider demand for the goods that this emitting firm is emitting, you will see that the free market equilibrium is over here, and as a result of that, there is an external cost to society. And so what that means is the profit is privatized and the losses are socialized, and the taxpayer has to pick up all of these costs. And that is not sustainable. It is not very sustainable at all. And so these costs are both financial and non-financial. They are the costs of trying to remedy the damage that we've already done, but it's also the costs of implementing climate change adaptation measures to protect against sea level rise and all that jazz. However, the social equilibrium, which is the point at which the net benefit to society from this person's activities is equal to the cost to society, is all the way over here. And so we need to figure out a way to shift this to this. So one way to do that is just slap a tax on top. And to do that, essentially, you are increasing the costs to the firms who are emitting, and you are shifting the equilibrium over here. And as an added benefit from that, not only are you then not costing society money, but you're actually making society money because you're getting all this carbon tax revenue. So, governments around the world have actually experienced similar market failures and environmental crises before. In the 80s, the United States had an issue with acid rain, and that was caused by excessive sulfur dioxide emissions into the atmosphere by industry. And so the government actually successfully implemented a system known as cap and trade, which resolved the issue. And then we did it again in the context of ozone layer depletion. So we thought we would try it a third time for climate change. So how is it supposed to work? So the goal, say that you have your emitting firm here who is burning petrol, whereas this is a cleaner alternative. So as you can see, this firm can do a hell of a lot more for a lower price versus relative to the cleaner alternative. And so if you say to this person, can you stop that and do that instead? They'll say, no. Why would I? I'm going to make less money. But also, not only that, if I do that, my competitors won't. And then I'll go out of business, and then the emissions are the same. So this is where government intervention in the market comes in. So essentially, cap and trade as a system, the government says, all right, we're going to set a maximum cap on the amount of emissions that the whole economy of our country can emit. And once we set that cap, that gives us the ability to modify the supply and demand curves based on the laws of economics. So what we need to do is we need to make emitting more expensive and not emitting cheaper. So once we set our cap, we essentially issue permits. And so for each permit, you can emit 1 tonne of emissions. And then we're going to say to everyone in the industry, every year there's going to be less permits. And so every year the cost of emitting is going to increase. And as the cost of emitting increases, in theory, what should happen is these people switch over to this technology, which might be a new or emerging technology, which has not hit economies of scale yet. And that will become cheaper. But then, on top of just setting a cap and restricting supply and increasing price, we're also going to incentivize people to do this as fast as possible. Because if you are in an emitting industry and you have heaps of permits and you change your behaviors faster, you can then sell your permits to people who are not changing their behaviors, and then you are making more money. So the point of cap and trade is essentially it's supposed to act as both a stick and a carrot. You're supposed to punish emitters for slow behavior. If they're too slow, they're going to go out of business. If they're a little bit slow, their costs are going to be higher than their competitors. And so essentially there's two issues. Like the carbon price needs to be high enough to encourage behavioral change, but it needs to be low enough so that the market doesn't collapse and then it just shifts overseas where they have weaker regulations and they continue emitting anyway. So experts believe that the global price of carbon needs to be between 50 to 100 USD per tonne by 2030, which is approximately 70 to 150 New Zealand dollars. Back in the early days of the carbon market, it went as low as 89 cents per tonne of emissions in 2012. And so we have a bit of a chicken and egg situation here, or rather a game of chicken, in which everyone needs to do the same thing at the same time. Otherwise it doesn't work. And we get emissions leakage. So how have we done it here? So we've implemented a system called the emissions trading scheme, and after the price of carbon in 2012 dropped to 89 cents per tonne, we decided that we're just going to do it ourselves. So we delinked from the international market, which was created by the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and created our own entirely unique system for us. So how it works is participants in the ETS are required to surrender 1 New Zealand unit for each tonne of their emissions. To drive the behavioural change, we need all of the participants to know that the price of carbon is only going in one direction, and that is up. The government has introduced a concept called emissions budgets, and so essentially what this means is governments are required to put in writing and publish 5-year total amounts of carbon that can be emitted within that period, and they need to do that for the next 15 years. So the intention of this is for our budgets to steadily go down until we get to 2050, which is when we get to net zero emissions, with the caveat of agriculture is not included currently. And so to do that, we need successive governments to take the issue seriously as well. So like I just alluded to, 50% of the economy is currently captured within the emissions trading scheme, and that is essentially everyone except agriculture. And what participants in the scheme have to do is they have to annually report on their emissions and then surrender units to the government for those emissions. But how do you get your New Zealand units? So this comes back to the idea of cap and trade and the diminishing supply of units to drive price increases in emissions. So the main means for the government to sell New Zealand units is through auctions. And so these are quite interesting mechanisms. They happen once a quarter. The most recent one was about 4 hours ago. Each auction has a fixed amount of units which are available for sale. There is a reserve price, and if the price does not hit that floor, then no units are sold, which decreases the total amounts of emissions that the country can emit if it happens for a full year anyway. And then there are reserve units, which are released if the clearing price is sufficiently high enough that the government is satisfied that we can emit more, but the price is high enough that in the future behaviour will change. Free allocation. So this is something which seems counterproductive conceptually, but essentially the government has identified the industries which are most prone to emissions leakage. So those are the participants who, if we tax them too hard, they will just leave and go somewhere else and keep emitting. And so we give those industries free units, but we tell them next year we're giving you less. But then, I guess the carrot in the equation is sequestration. So, like I said, we not just need to emit less, but we need to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so the way to do that is to grow heaps of trees. I mean, that's one way to do it. There's other ways to do it as well. But this is the one which is most prevalent now. And so essentially, for every 1 tonne of carbon you take out of the atmosphere, you get a unit. And then you can sell your unit to someone else. And so the obvious winner of the scheme is the forestry industry. Heaps of money for them. But that's called sequestration. So like I say, I guess the point of the system, what makes it different to just slapping a flat tax on top of an activity is to say, we're not just going to stop you from doing this, we're going to try and encourage you to compete with each other to see who can do it the fastest. And so once you have an NZU, every NZU is equal. It doesn't matter if you bought it at auction. It doesn't matter if you took it out of the atmosphere. It's worth the same. And then you can sell it to people who need it. And so how are we doing? Well, in New Zealand, we actually have been doing relatively okay. So here you can see the carbon price in New Zealand from 2010 to 2022. It peaked in late 2022 at about $90 per tonne of emissions, which is a good comeback from 89 cents over here. And then you can see there is a close correlation with the rising price of emitting versus the decrease in emissions. And New Zealand actually has managed to do a relatively okay job in the last decade in resolving some of its issues. However, the bad news is that the market crashed in 2023. The previous government had a plan, and then the polls started looking bad, and they threw the plan in the bin, and then confidence in the market went down, and then you can see that it just plummeted down. It dropped nearly half in value from 2022, which is very quick, and it just demonstrates how the whole point of the system is undermined when there's no consistency in our approach. So it crashed again in May because the current government signalled that they wanted to decrease the reserve price at auction, and then everyone told them that was a stupid idea, so they backtracked, which was good. And now we're currently in recovery mode, sort of. So I guess what do we do now? I guess, so we've got this system, and in theory it should work, but it's not. It's not working. And the reason that it's not working is the price is too low to drive change. And experts are in relative agreement that we need the carbon price to be a lot higher than it is right now for anything to actually change and for us to correct this market failure. So like I said earlier, we need the NZU price to reach at least $70 in the short term, and preferably about $150 in the long term. And as of right now, the price at auction, the reserve price, was $64, and today the auction failed. Actually, no one even showed up. There were no bidders. And that is because on the secondary market, the price is only $60. And so why would you buy at auction when you can just go to the secondary market? And it's kind of a whole separate talk, but it's not necessarily a bad thing with an auction failing, because it means there's less units available for emissions in the future. But yeah, it's not a perfect system, but the idea is sound, and we just need to sort it out. So I guess, my closing comments is this should work, but it's not. The reason it hasn't worked is the price is too low. The reason the price is too low is because governments around the world, and the government in New Zealand as well, has not given industries sufficient belief that this approach is actually going to stick. And so people speculate. The issue, I suppose, is if the clock is ticking on climate change, and we're sort of running out of time, and we need to do this as fast as possible, and every day is another day, right? And so we can't wait for the free market to correct this, because it will be too late. And so we need governments to intervene. And that, if you look at New Zealand in the global context, like last time Trump got elected, he backed out of the Paris Agreement, and that caused significant concern for everyone. And the carbon markets responded accordingly. But there's also another issue, which is something which I don't think is really talked about enough politically. And that is, if we act too slowly, we actually jeopardize our economy. Like, it's all well and good to say we don't want to raise the costs of production domestically, but the EU has already put in place what's called a border adjustment mechanism, where if they import goods from overseas and the country of origin for those goods is not subject to an emissions tax which is as high as in the importing country, then they'll just charge them the difference. And so what that means is, if we are not taxing internally, someone else will just tax us when we export, and then we're subsidizing their climate response rather than ours, which is not really a good outcome. And currently the carbon border adjustment mechanism has also excluded agriculture, but there's no guarantee that is going to remain the case going forwards. And so it's all interlinked, and it's just really difficult when we've all got our own political quirks. Nice way of putting it. Which can undermine consistency and certainty. So that's my talk. I was worried my talk would be too long, but I think I went too through too fast. But are there any questions?
Yes.
Hello.
I'm wondering, if you're an organisation, a business, what are the triggers or the thresholds which require you to start buying carbon credits?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So we all interact with the emissions trading scheme every day, but we just don't know it. And the reason for that is because it's taxed higher up the supply chain. So for example, when you go to fill up your car with petrol, the carbon price is part of the price that you're paying. It's just that the importer has already paid it. And so when you're a business, it depends on what you're doing. So for example, a lot of emissions are caused through process heat. So if you're in an industry and you're producing something like bricks, you'll need a lot of heat. And if you're using a certain type of fuel, then you will be emitting. And there is a threshold on a per fuel basis that once you cross, you need to sign up to the ETS. You need to report your emissions to the Environmental Protection Agency and then surrender units for them.
So it's basically fuel and nothing else?
It's a lot of things. I thought about including the legislation, but it's really long and really complicated and uses lots of chemistry words. So.
The second question I have is, if you have to start complying,
Yeah.
what does it cost you as a business to get everything happening, register, comply, decide?
I think that the system is currently a bit more confusing than it needs to be in terms of the information that the government provides in compliance. So I suppose I would suggest that you talk to a lawyer about it, who would then be able to put you on the right path. But also, if you don't want to talk to a lawyer, you can just ask the government, and they'll tell you. Like you could ask the Environmental Protection Agency or the Ministry for the Environment, and I'm sure they will be able to give you all the info you need. Hello.
I wonder how you deal with the fact that this is kind of unfortunately like a group project. And
Yeah.
that, like, as much as New Zealand, and I would preface this by saying like I'm pro all of this, but we do as much as we can, and say places like Houston with Gasoline Alley.
Yes.
Take
Yeah.
advantage of that to be like, well, they're doing that, so we can up our. How do you kind of deal with that situation where other places might decide, okay, well, they're making up for our.
Yeah, so I mean that's emissions leakage, right? And it's the sad reality is there's not really anything we can do about it. And we need America to come to the table. We need China and India to come to the table as well. And particularly in the case, I guess, of those countries, emitting is sort of key to their industries. And like the transition, it can't happen overnight. It should have happened 30 years ago. And it hasn't, and now people are saying, well, we can't do it, it's too hard. But, I mean, we just have to do it. We just have to. It's like a group project.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a due date. Yeah. Hello. So, I'm not meant to be political, but, I mean, objectively, yes, sort of, yeah. But there's the two perspectives, I suppose, are that I don't know if it's true or not, but apparently our agriculture has less emissions per output than other countries, and so it might be a benefit to keep it here. Doesn't mean that we couldn't do better, but that's sort of where the political hot potato comes. It's like, we're already the best. Should we be better? Probably, yeah. And if I guess it's, the main risk for agriculture and not doing anything about it is foreign carbon taxes, essentially, because it's going to be hard to adapt should they be implemented, and we have done no prep. Yeah. Got a lot of questions.
One more.
You pick. I don't want to pick favorites.
And the way back.
So there are some political quirks which we don't talk about, but there are also the ecological quirks, right? And
Yeah.
So forestry is a big winner, obviously, pine in particular. And the last time I checked, you couldn't use a lot of native species because of their diameter. So is that part of the conversation? Because they're really long-term
Yeah,
biodiversity
yeah, for sure.
decline, and is part of the conversation transitioning to native?
Yeah, so that's a live debate which is currently ongoing, and the reason why pine has been relied on so much is just because of, I suppose, the urgency of climate change, and pine trees do sequester carbon faster than native trees, but native trees sequester carbon for longer than pine trees, and so some people have proposed essentially planting pine trees and then planting native trees under them. And then once the pine trees grow and we, cut them down, but we don't burn them because it defeats the point. we use it for building or something. And then that would be, I suppose, a solution which short term helps go towards solving the issue, but long term it does have those biodiversity benefits.